Like Thoreau, Zane Omar found solitude companionable. In a reflection for Beacon Broadside, he shared an experience about the breakup of a relationship, a horrible ending that left him lacking self-confidence so badly that he isolated himself for months. He came home from work every day and locked himself in his apartment. On weekends, he never left. After nearly a year, he went out to dinner with an old friend who was in town for a few days. Then he went for dessert and crepes at another establishment, and the next morning, his credit card company called him. Their algorithms noticed that going out was unusual for him. It was his wake-up call. It forced home to him that he needed to make a plan to get out of isolation. And that's how isolation works. It becomes a pattern, a rut, if we're not careful. You know, most weeks my husband Joe and I get Sunday afternoon together and all day Monday, and the rest of the week we hardly see each other. And lately, we're working simultaneously on different floors of the house all day, and still we hardly see each other. But the sharing of space is really felt. On Monday, we didn't go off somewhere like we usually do because we couldn't. But we found that we both needed some time alone, so he retreated to his sewing room, and I went out to the garage where I began refinishing a dresser I picked up off the tree lawn a few weeks ago. I really got into the rhythm of the job. It was mindless, but vaguely creative. It was restorative for me and for the piece of wooden furniture. The solitude, honestly, was heaven, but short. Lately, I've been hearing a lot from folks about how they're struggling with all the togetherness as they're trapped in their houses with loved ones. Other folks are saying just the opposite to me. One friend who had been at that point of self-quarantine his house for 13 days told me earlier in the week that he'd love to have someone around, even if it was just to bicker. It got me thinking about the difference between solitude and isolation and how either can be in the company of others. Solitude or isolation can also be by choice or the outcome of an unfortunate set of circumstances. They're both completely universal, even necessary. Just about every world religion has it in their narrative, usually as part of the formative text. Jews spent 40 years wandering the desert as an isolated group, forming one community from 12 tribes. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert, resisting the temptation of sin. Siddhartha Gautama, the great Buddha, sat alone under the Bodhi tree for 7 weeks, seeking enlightenment. In modern times, the Aboriginal Australian practice of temporary mobility for adolescents, the practice that used to be called walkabout, is intended as a time of solitary travel to religious sites and extended family members. And the Amish Rumspringa, which means running or hopping around literally, is a chance for teenagers to leave the fold of the nuclear family, sometimes even going to live among the English. And all of these practices, just to name a few, are about intentionally separating from the community, either as a group from the dominant culture in order to deepen the practices of the group, or as individuals distancing themselves from their own circumstances in order to have a fuller sense of self upon their return. In Thoreau's time at Walden, he was intentionally physically isolated from the rest of the people at Concord. And while he may have spent most of his most enjoyable times in isolating practices, it was a short time. And when he returned, like Jesus or Buddha or 90% of Amish youth, he was more committed to his community, more deeply rooted in his beliefs, and full of creative energy that allowed him to be a trailblazer, whose influence is still felt today. What makes a time of isolation successful is intentionality, making the choice to make the most of the circumstances. Jesus didn't choose to be tempted by Satan. The Jews didn't choose to wander the desert. But like Buddha, they did choose to make the most of it, to pare down their existence and live with only the essentials in order to find the most elemental core characteristics of their work and their lives. A time of isolation can be a time of reflection, taking stock in what matters and getting rid of everything that doesn't, in order to forge a more creative and ultimately effective future. That's why I've been asking you to send photos of you and your family and the things that inspire you. Music that you make, no matter how imperfect it may be, and readings or other media that inspire you to something great. This time, if we choose to make it so, can be a great time of creativity, of figuring out new ways to live out our mission in the world and connect with a wider audience of people who could benefit from our message. I know we're about to embark on difficult times. Not just the deaths that we're about to experience among us, but the economic hardships that are sure to result from this shutdown. It's going to be a lot longer than 40 days. And we're never going to be the same after this. But this can be a time for celebrating and nurturing the good in the world and imagining what it could be. This could be a time for unleashing our inner artists, dreamers, and creators, if we choose to make it so. Now, I'm not saying that we have to separate ourselves in the desert, or starve ourselves, or avoid all contact with family and friends as we deal with our demons. We can stay connected. But if we choose reflection and meaningful conversation, we can use this time for the benefit of ourselves and everyone else. We're already hearing about little innovations that may never have happened had it not been for this forced isolation. Reverend Emily was telling me about a member of her congregation who works part-time in New York and part-time in Sweden. She mentioned to a coworker who happens to be a member of the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Stockholm that their Staten Island congregation would be having a virtual coffee hour after the service. So a bunch of folks from Sweden watched the service in New York and joined the conversation afterward, bringing new light to an old practice. Isolation in these dangerous times, done with intentionality, can be a mechanism for beginning to kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight.